¿Qué tal, disidencias de Valdivia, región de los Ríos y Universidad Austral de Chile? Soy Lilith Trujillo, estudiante de Administración Pública, integrante de la Secretaría de Género y Sexualidades y además fundadora de Panteras Disidentes. Nos encontramos hoy día en un episodio muy especial porque tenemos un invitado internacional que vino gracias a el inicio del año académico de la Facultad de Humanidades, donde nos encontramos hoy en su estudio. Muchas gracias al equipo de vinculación con el medio y, por supuesto, también a nuestra casa radial, Radio UACh Valdivia. Este episodio va a ser en inglés, así que a la vuelta de la siguiente pausa vamos a conversar con el profesor Keenan, Harper Keenan, quien nos acompañará durante algunos días esta semana. Ha sido posible gracias a la articulación con esta Facultad de Filosofía y Humanidades a través de diversos proyectos de investigación financiados por la Agencia Nacional de Investigación y Desarrollo, ANID, Proyecto Fundadora, Educación en Cambio Climático en Chile, Análisis Exploratorio de Políticas, Currículo y Prácticas Escolares y de Formación Inicial Docente del doctor Iván Salinas de la Universidad de Chile, así como también el proyecto Fondesit, Formando Docentes para la Inclusión, Procesos, Orientaciones y Prácticas en la Formación Inicial del doctor Javier Campos y el proyecto Fondesit Anillo, Despatriarcar y Descolonizar desde el sur de Chile, Género e Investigación en la Formación Inicial Docente, alojado en nuestra facultad y liderado por la doctora Elizabeth Martínez Palma, junto a los colegas Gerardo Muñoz, Damaso Rabanal del Instituto de Ciencias de la Educación y las doctoras Rubí Carreño Bolívar y Margarita Calderón López, de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile y Universidad de Chile, respectivamente. Estamos aquí en el estudio también con mis compañeros de Panteras Disidentes, Víctor Zurita y Roche Uquemán. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos el día de hoy, a todo nuestro panel trans hoy día, a puertas también de un día de la visibilidad trans el 31 de marzo. Estén atentos a nuestro Instagram, panteras.disidentes y SEGESEX UACh, donde estaremos compartiendo las convocatorias que organizamos por la fecha. A la vuelta de esta pausita, por la señal 90.1 y canal 52 y 843 de la señal Tel Sur, conversamos con el doctor Harper Keenan. Welcome back to the Ronroneo Disidente, the only diversity and LGBT people show in the radio of the south of Chile. Today we have a very special guest joining us for an insightful conversation on gender, sexuality, and education. Dr. Harper Benjamin Keenan is the Robert Quartermain Professor of Gender and Sexuality and an Assistant Professor in the Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy at the Faculty of Education, the University of British Columbia, based at the Vancouver campus on the traditional territory of Musqueam people. Dr. Keenan's work explored the intersection of education, identity, and social justice, helping to shape more inclusive and equitable learning environments. We are thrilled to him here to discuss his research, the challenge and the opportunity in gender inclusive in education, and the role of the curriculum and fostering social change. Dr. Keenan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Nice to have you here. Let's start. Can you tell us a little about your academic journey and how you became interested in gender and sexuality study with education?
Sure, yeah. Well, first, let me say again what an honor it is to be in conversation with you all here. I started my career as a kindergarten teacher in New York City, and I was teaching 5- and 6-year-old kids. And I came into the classroom as a trans educator, and that experience alone left me with so many questions about how children learn about gender at school in all the very explicit ways and also the ways that that shows up that are more subtle. And so I decided that I wanted to go into a PhD program and learn more about that. And today my research is all about how children learn about gender at school.
As the teacher of gender or sexuality, what does your role entail, and what are some of the key themes you focus on your work?
So, in terms of the work that I do, I'm affiliated with a program at UBC where I work called SOGI UBC that focuses on supporting anti-oppressive education around gender and sexuality for teachers in K-12 schools as they do their teacher education. So we help our students to think more deeply about the role of gender and sexuality in their students' lives. We have a mentorship program that connects queer and trans students who are learning to be teachers with experienced queer and trans teachers so that they have mentors. And we provide professional development to people who are trans and queer and also to people who are not trans and queer in thinking about gender and sexuality in the classroom. And we do lots of other things. You can check us out at our website, sogiubc.ubc.ca, I believe is the address. Yeah. And then I also do research. And right now I'm working on a book about children's experiences of gender in kindergarten and first grade in the United States, specifically in San Francisco. And the challenge for young children in practicing anything like self-determination around gender in school because of the way schools think about children and childhood. So I think both about gender and about how childhood is structured in relation to adulthood.
Okay. So, in that same line, how do you see the current state of gender and sexuality education in school? And what are some of the biggest challenges that educators face?
Well, all over the world, unfortunately, we are facing extreme hostility toward queer and trans young people in public schools, in K-12 public schools all around the world. And in part, that is backlash to the sort of small gains that trans people in particular have made in social movements around the world. But those social movement gains were not always accompanied by structures that supported queer and trans people in school officially. And so now we're seeing that queer and trans people are very visible, but they are not protected by the level of policy and procedure that they need and access to supports at school that trans young people in particular need. And so at the same time as there is this hostility that's happening, and in the United States we see things like books being banned, teachers being told that they can't even mention gender and sexuality, and this kind of very hostile climate is spreading around the world. We see the same thing happening in the United Kingdom, for example, as well as elsewhere. And that's all accompanied by the denial of trans-affirming healthcare to young people, which is also a disaster. But at the same time as all these terrible things are happening, what I also see happening is really beautiful organizing, like what all of you are doing here, which is queer and trans young people coming together and imagining totally beautiful, different ways of being, creating things like podcasts, radio programs, fashion shows, art practices, performances that, you know, if adults actually paid attention to what they were doing, it would totally blow their minds. So I also see beautiful resistance happening by queer and trans young people, so that gives me a lot of hope for the future.
So what other strategies or approaches do you recommend for making curriculum more inclusive and reflexive of diverse identities?
So I've been talking to a lot of people here in Valdivia over the last couple of days, and I've said this several times, but I think one of the most important things that adults can do when they're working with children is to really listen to what the children are asking of the adults. It starts there, is really getting to know your students very, very well, listening to them and responding to their needs as they themselves express them. And so you have to set your classroom up in a way that children can show you what they need, they can tell you what they need, and then you, as an adult, have to respond to them. And so that might look like making sure that your classroom library has books that reflect people of lots of different genders, languages, races, cultures. That helps children to feel more included, and also can open their eyes to people who are different than them. too. So things like your classroom library, and then also going through all the practices that you might have in your classroom and thinking about, when does gender show up? Do I do things like organizing when I line my students up to move through the school, do I put them in a boys line and a girls line? Some schools still do that. It seems very antiquated to me, but some schools still do that. Do you hold particular expectations about the ways that girls or boys are supposed to dress or act, or things that they are supposed to play with or explore in the classroom? And then how do you explicitly and implicitly communicate that to your students in ways that might really confine the possibilities of who they can be and become? So a lot of it is about self-reflection on the part of the teacher, as well as opening lots of channels for children to communicate their needs to adults.
So, in your experience, how do usually the students and the teachers respond to this inclusive gender and sexuality education?
Great question. My experience is that students are very flexible. Children, and the younger they are, the more flexible they are. The quicker they learn things, like, I have spent time in preschool classrooms where students learn gender-neutral pronouns, like they and them, for example, and they pick them up really quick, and it's not a big deal. So children tend to be very flexible, very curious. They're always eager to learn about new things about the world. They love to figure out ways that they are similar and different from other people. So for kids, it tends not to be a big deal. If anything, it is really liberatory for them to know, oh, I can dress in all these different fun ways. I can express myself in all these different fun ways. It's the adults that tend to be the ones that have a hard time adjusting to ways of being that might be different from what they were told was the right way to be or the correct way to be when they were growing up. And I think that's all the more reason why we really have to practice a responsive way of teaching, which is to say being responsive to students rather than being responsive to kind of reproducing the rules and routines of adults. But yeah, the kids tend to be much more flexible than the adults. I've almost never actually seen children go through kind of gender inclusive curriculum and really struggle with it. Certainly I've seen children tease each other or bully each other, but when they are actually offered the opportunity to think about the harm that does, almost all of the time the kids are responsive to that. It's the adults that are much more challenging to work with.
Okay, so in regards of research and impact, your research examines the relationship between curriculum and social justice. How do you believe curriculum can be a tool for positive social change?
So I think about curriculum in a way that is different from how some people think about curriculum. So some people think about curriculum as a script that you write before you go into a classroom. And then you do your curriculum exactly as your script told you to. The way that I think about curriculum is your approach to children. So a lot of people call that pedagogy, your way of talking and interacting with children, your way of teaching children. And I think that both curriculum and pedagogy have to align with the kind of world that you want to live in. And so, you can organize your classroom in a way that is very authoritarian or even fascist. And that might look like the adult has total power over the students. Or you could think about, well, what would a more liberatory way of organizing ourselves in the classroom actually look like? And the amazing thing, there's so many things that are wrong with schools, but the amazing thing about schools is that they are a place where children are in the majority. It's one of the only places where children outnumber adults. And so if adults can help to facilitate kids and their work in schools in a way that imagines different ways of being together that are more cooperative, collaborative, kinder, that help to really get into the big social problems and think about, well, how are we going to address all these problems in our society? How can we imagine a different way of being? It could be so powerful. Instead of saying, you know, we have to learn our times tables, you know, here, 2 times 2 is 4. You just repeat after me. It's very boring. That kind of teaching is so boring. Kids fall asleep. It's so boring. So you want to, I believe in these pedagogies and curriculum that really invite children into the big questions of the world and help them to imagine different ways of being together.
That's beautiful. And in your research, there have been constant situations where intersectionalities between race, ethnicity, culture, and gender have been present. What relationship can you identify between these factors and the colonization in the American continent?
I'm really glad that you asked that question. When I started my PhD, and actually my dissertation was entirely focused on how young children learn about colonization in school. So I spent a lot of time thinking about colonization and how it has shaped dominant approaches to schooling in colonized societies. And so I'll say a couple of things about this. First, it is because of the colonial model of schooling that we have things like strict gender categories, that we have classrooms that are organized in very authoritarian ways, because many of the early public schools were designed as a way of sort of controlling the poor and socializing them into the ideology of the nation. And so that's part of why classrooms are so rigid and they're so hostile to queer and trans people. And that is, of course, deeply intertwined with colonial history. Now, with specific regard to gender, what we know, and this is very well documented across historical research, is that a key part of colonization was to enforce ideas about gender that were developed in Europe onto indigenous populations. And so that meant that to be a man meant being like a European man, or to be a woman meant being like a European woman. But it also meant that anyone who was not a man or a woman and might belong to what we would in English-speaking societies refer to as transgender. But there are many identifications within indigenous communities prior to colonization, and even still today, that don't translate directly into transgender, but were neither male nor female. And those communities were often intensely persecuted by colonial governments, and we can see the residue of that in the way that colonial law persists into the present.
Thank you. You were talking about a book you are working lately. Would you like to tell us more about that?
Sure, yeah. So the book that I'm writing, and hopefully one day it will be published, is called Unmanageable Subjects, Trans Childhoods and the Struggle for Self-Determination in Schools. It's being published by Beacon Press. And for that project, I spent 2 years studying how gender works in kindergarten and first grade in the United States. Specifically, I was studying in San Francisco. And so for one of those 2 years, I spent 5 days a week going back to school with kids, sitting in tiny chairs that were very uncomfortable for me as an adult, and watching how gender nonconforming and trans kids were being treated in their earliest experiences in school. And I think the biggest contributions of the book are both in understanding gender in childhood, but also in understanding how adults relate to children, particularly the ways that adults try to manage who children can be and become, which applies certainly to many groups other than trans kids, applies to indigenous children, to racialized children, to disabled children. So many oppressed groups of children are being managed by adults in their schools in ways that are very confining for them. And so that book is all about managing children in childhood. It's all about gender in early childhood. Yeah, and I'm hoping it'll be out in about a year.
I hope to read it.
Can I ask something outside of the plan? You talked about disabled children, and also in your congress, the Monday, you said something about an autistic child. So we as an organization have a lot of focus into the neurodivergent communities and disabled communities, partly because most of us are neurodivergent. So I wanted to ask you about if you can talk a little bit about that.
So there's a lot of really wonderful research on the nexus of trans identification and neurodivergence. My colleague, Dr. Logan Smilges, who wrote a book, oh my goodness, I'm going to forget the title, but wrote a really wonderful book about that. I can give you their name after we talk. And a lot of that work talks about how there's a lot of overlap between the trans community and the neurodivergent community. And the thing is, lots of people like to ask, well, why is that? And personally, I don't think that really matters, because often when we ask why is that, we're getting at how do we make less of that overlap? And I don't think there needs to be less. All that to say, I think we have a lot to learn from neurodivergent and autistic people about thinking about gender differently, in ways that I think, and I say this as a person who is not neurodivergent and is not autistic, but I think that when you relate to the world differently, of course, you're going to have a different way of understanding gender. And I think that all of us have a great deal to learn from that. And there's a lot of up-and-coming neurodivergent trans scholars who are doing great work in this area. And I'm happy to share more names with you later.
Thank you.
And Harper, for closing and personal perspective, I'd like to ask you for your tattoo. How many tattoos do you have? And can you show us from your...
I can't show you all of them because they're like under my pants on my thighs.
No, but in your...
yeah, so this
your
one,
shoulder.
I can tell you about this one. It's kind of relevant to our conversation.
Beautiful. Can you show us to the...
Camera. So that tattoo is from a hand-drawn picture of two pirates, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who... Those are the names that we know of them, but they were born female, and they lived their lives as men, and they, had a wild pirate life. And Anne Bonny is one of the most famous pirates who was quote unquote born female, and Anne was my great 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 aunt. Yeah, so that's my trans pirate story. And when I came out as trans, to my grandfather, I thought, oh no, this might not go so well. He's my grandfather, right? Like this, I'm nervous. And I told him that I was trans, and he said, oh, it's just like your great great aunt, which maybe is not the right term to use, but we are related. He's like, it runs in the family. It's okay. You're just a pirate. You're a gender pirate.
And you have built a beautiful family now. You have a son. And what advice would you give to trans people who also want to start a family?
That's a great question. I'm only a year and a half into parenting, so I'm always hesitant to give any kind of parenting advice because I'm still figuring it out myself. But I think in general, what I want other trans people, particularly younger trans people, to know is, let yourself imagine the most beautiful life for yourself, and then, do your best to create it. Build a community around yourself that will help you to create it. And I have everything in my life because I have a beautiful community around me that supported me. And my child now has a beautiful community around him to support him. And, you know, I was really kind of nervous about what it would be like to be a trans parent. But the moment that he was born, all of my worries about that specific thing, about being a trans parent, just totally faded away. And it became all about, well, how do I change a diaper? How do I feed a tiny baby? Everything becomes very simple, very, very much about, you know, just caring for a child. And I feel so grateful to be able to do this. And I think it's so important that trans people are given access to reproductive health care that allows them to have children. Because quite frankly, I think trans people make great parents and great family members.
And did you came here with your family?
Yes.
What impression do you have of our country, and how do you see the locally organized trans community? We're here with our president of the trans community here, Panteras Disidentes, and Ro is in the director too. What impression do you have? What memories you went for?
That's a great question. I mean, I've had a really wonderful time here. I felt very warmly welcomed. And so what that tells me is that it is possible to build a very warm and welcoming community around trans people here. And I hope that that becomes possible for every trans person living in this region, not just the trans people that are coming and visiting from the United States, for example. And I know that all of you here are working really hard to build that. And I hope that the people who are not trans will join you in working toward that kind of warm community that I have experienced over the last few days. Because I think you all are doing really incredible work. And, you know, it's so exciting that, you know, you're out here running for public office. Like these are big moves. I think you all are doing really big, important things here and making really important change in your community.
I'm the first woman on my faculty and economics, administrative and faculty. You being the first one transgender in your university or in your career?
Not at my university. I am lucky to be at a university where there were trans people working there before I got there. Yeah, but I was the only trans person in my cohort when I got my PhD, and that was difficult. And I think often trans people find ourselves in positions of being the only one. But, you know, I also have to say I've been pleasantly surprised more often than not to find out, oh, actually, there was someone that came before me. It's just that nobody knew that person's name.
Yeah, there's no memory.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's impossible not to mention the international situation. What do you think about trans rise to the power in the U.S.? In what ways can the LGBT community movement prepare to counter hate speech?
I mean, not to say the same thing over and over again, but I think, you know, the most important thing we can do is organize our own communities, starting really local, like you all are doing here, to build systems of formal and informal protection for trans people, and, you know, participating in local government, to make sure that there are policies and protections for trans people at a local level. And when you start that way from the grassroots, you know, it grows up. And I think at the same time, we also need to be organizing for greater protection from international organizations like the United Nations and other international bodies. But I do think that local work of organizing with your own community, in your own local government, your own institution, is what's going to make the most impact.
And what advice will you give to the educators, parents, and students who want to foster a more inclusive learning environment?
I'm trying to think beyond what I've already said.
For closing.
Yeah. I think just know that your actions make a huge difference. When you are an educator, you have enormous power. And so if you can take a few steps toward a more inclusive and welcoming classroom, your students will feel that impact. So if you're questioning, is this worth it? Can I really make a difference? The answer is always yes, you can. So think about 2 or 3 actions that you can take every day to make your classroom more inclusive or welcoming. Thinking about, what books am I reading today? Can I choose something that is going to make children feel more welcome in my classroom? Maybe it's a book about LGBT kids or about pride or something like that. Or maybe it's rethinking how you're organizing play materials in the classroom and having kids experiment with different kinds of toys that they haven't played with before, maybe in ways that challenge gender stereotypes, and having a conversation with your students about that. So just thinking about, 2 or 3 actions a day that you can take to make your classroom more welcoming, I think will make a huge impact on your students.
Thank you, Harper. Is there anything else would you like to add or emphasize before we wrap up?
I don't think so. Thank you so much for having me. I mean, this is so wonderful to be in conversation with all of you. So such a treat for me. Thank you.
And do you have something to say to the trans people who is seeing us on TV? And I hope so, international TV. I think that it's beautiful to see how the trans community could organize in international level, because the trans followers, the Malay followers, the cat followers here, they are organized in international level. So we must to do the same and better. And I hope so to see you again in this university in another part of the world. Would you like to say something?
I would like to say thank you so much for your work. I think it's really inspiring to see, first of all, a trans adult, and especially someone who has done so many research and has done your part to help your own community. I think it's beautiful and it inspires myself because I want to do the same.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's no trans man here with PhD.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you so much, because the same. I hope to do a work similar to yours one day. So thank you a lot.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here. It's great to be in conversation.
And thanks you to our radio house, Radio UACh. This is the only program of LGBT plus community in the south of Chile. So we have to say goodbye, but you can see us on Radio UACh Valdivia TV, or how do you say canal on YouTube media and Facebook. You can search us in Radio UACh Valdivia, and in Instagram Panteras Disidentes and SEGESEX UACh. Thanks to the Humanity Facultad of University Austral of Chile for this show, and of course thanks to the people who can make this possible. I have to give a very thank you to Damaso Rabanal because he came this show especially. So thank you to Heber Harper for come here, and I hope to see you in another show or in another place. Gracias a la comunidad de Valdivia y de la región de los ríos, disidencias del sur de Chile. Les enviamos un hermoso saludo y nos pueden ver los viernes a las 21 horas por el canal de Radio UACh Valdivia y también en las señales de 90.1 FM y canal 52 y 843 de la señal del sur. Soy Lilith Trujillo y este fue Ronroneo Bilingüe.